The Honorable, the member from Red Bay, continuing. How much time? The member has 1 hour and 14 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will see if I can squeeze this in. Mr. Speaker, when we took the luncheon adjournment, I was about to start my discussion on the issue of what constitutes not reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. I was at page 11, and I think the Minister of Tourism had asked me where I was reading from in the letter from KSG attorneys. And
the Honorable Member, just to let the gallery know that our protocols are in play. Gallery is 6 feet apart unless you're a family. Please be mindful of our protocols. And just to be seated 6 feet apart unless you're a family. Thank you. Continue, Honorable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I had just concluded, and I think I perhaps should go over that so that it flows naturally. This issue about compulsory medical intervention. Mr. Speaker, I am again reading from the letter from KSG of 7th of September to all members of Parliament, the Governor, and the Chief Medical Officer. Any compulsory medical intervention, however minor, is an interference with the right to private and family life assured by Section 9 of the Bill of Rights. This obviously includes mandatory vaccinations. In Solomakin against Ukraine 2003 appeal case, the European Court on Human Rights stated at paragraph 33 that, quote, compulsory vaccination as an involuntary medical treatment amounts to an interference with the right to respect for one's private life, which includes a person's physical and psychological integrity, as guaranteed by Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, or Section 9 of the Bill of Rights here is in similar terms. There can therefore be, the writer of the letter continues, there can therefore be little doubt that the enforcement of a mandatory vaccination law would amount to an interference with Section 9 of the Bill of Rights. The question is whether the state, meaning the Cayman Islands government, could avail itself of Section 9, subsection 3, subsection A, on the basis that the implementation of a mandatory vaccination law was reasonably justifiable in a democratic society in the interests of public health. That involves an assessment of proportionality. Ultimately, this requires striking a balance between the citizens' personal integrity and the public interest in protecting the health of the population. Again, reference to the case Solomakin. In cases concerning compatibility with Section 9, and this is important, Mr. Speaker, important that members on the other side understand this. In cases concerning compatibility with Section 9 of the Constitution, it is for the state, that is the Cayman Islands government, to prove that the interference is justified by providing relevant and sufficient reasons. That statement comes from another East European Court of Human Rights case, Vavrika against the Czech Republic in 2013. The author of the letter continues, it is our client's strongly held position that a mandatory vaccination law in the Cayman Islands cannot be reasonably justifiable in a democratic society because, one, the state cannot present sufficient scientific data to establish the safety and efficacy of these COVID vaccines, and two, the state cannot establish that there are no other means of achieving the same end that would interfere less seriously with the fundamental right to private life. Mr. Speaker, I am not going to read the explanation or the basis for those conclusions. They are in the letter. All members have the letter, and I would invite them, if they have not already done so, to read it carefully. The other fundamental right, Mr. Speaker, that the author of the letter asserts is being or will be breached if the legislation is passed in its current form is Section 10 of our Bill of Rights, which deals with conscience and religion. Section 10 of the Bill of Rights states, no person shall be hindered by government in the enjoyment of his or her freedom of conscience. 10.2, freedom of conscience includes freedom of thought and of religion or religious denomination. Freedom to change his or her religion, religious denomination or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, both in public and in private, to manifest and propagate his or her religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, observance, and day of worship. Section 10 goes on in subsection 6 to say, the other subsections not being relevant to this particular aspect, nothing in any law or done under its authority shall be held to contravene this section to the extent that it is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society in the interests of public health. Section 10 of the Bill of Rights substantially mirrors Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights and Article 18 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. An individual may object to taking a COVID-19 vaccine on the basis of religious or other secular beliefs. A belief is a set of convictions that meet the criteria of, quote, cogency, seriousness, cohesion, and importance, unquote. Beliefs that meet these criteria are protected under Section 10 of the Bill of Rights. See Camel and Cozans against the United Kingdom, another European Court of Human Rights case from a long time ago, 1976. An enforced mandatory vaccination law amounts to the state interfering with the right to manifest a belief, that is, to object to a vaccination. There can be little doubt that there now exists in society a movement of people, whether due to religious or secular belief, who hold a set of convictions opposing vaccination that are cogent, serious, cohesive, and important. This is sufficient to amount to a belief which is protected by Section 10 of the Bill of Rights. A law that compelled vaccination would interfere with Section 10, especially where non-compliance would result in punishment. In effect, the law would be punishing people for exercising their beliefs. As to whether the interference with Section 10 is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society in the interest of public health, we refer you to the discussion above relating to Section 9. The same principles apply. Mr. Speaker, the next section which is addressed in the letter is Section 16, Non-Discrimination. And I read, Section 16 states, subject to subsections 3, 4, 5, and 6, government shall not treat any person in a discriminatory manner in respect of the rights under this part of the Constitution. 16.2, in this section, discriminatory means affording different and unjustifiable treatment to different persons on any ground, such as religion, political, or other opinion. 16.3, no law or decision of any public official shall contravene this section if it has an objective and reasonable justification and is reasonably proportionate to its aim in the interests of public health. Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights states, the enjoyment of the rights and freedoms set forth in this convention shall be secured without discrimination on any ground such as religion, political, or other opinion. For the reasons identified above in respect of Section 10, a mandatory vaccination law would interfere with enjoyment of a religious or conscientious secular objection. It would therefore interfere with both Section 10 and Section 16. Once again, the reasons why the interference would not be reasonably proportionate are set out above in respect of Section 9. Our client, the lawyer says, our client wishes to note that there is already significant discrimination against the unvaccinated compared to the vaccinated. For instance, pursuant to Regulation 3 of the Control of COVID-19 No. 2 Regulations 2021, unvaccinated people must complete a 14-day quarantine period on arrival in the jurisdiction. In contrast, under Regulation 4 of the Control of COVID-19 No. 2 Regulations 2021, vaccinated people must only complete a 5-day quarantine. At present, the government has not made readily available any scientific evidence to support the longer quarantine period for unvaccinated persons. The government's current policy, in the view of our client, amounts to discrimination under the Bill of Rights. We invite the government to make available the scientific evidence that underlies their policies and supports the establishment of these different quarantine periods for vaccinated and unvaccinated, if it exists. Our client fears that the government may be seeking to impose further discriminatory provisions based on whether individuals are vaccinated or unvaccinated, for instance, in relation to the grant of work permits. Likewise, our client is very concerned that the government is pressuring local businesses to implement mandatory vaccine requirements for their staff as a proxy for the government's own preferred vaccination policy. Clear evidence is required in order to justify such discrimination, and in our client's view, the government has not provided it. Without that evidence, provisions of this nature may breach the Bill of Rights under this and other sections. And the letter concludes, Mr. Speaker, in this way, it is our client's firm position that taking the unprecedented step of introducing a mandatory vaccination law in the Cayman Islands, thereby bypassing applicable principles of criminal and medical law, would lead to clear contraventions with the Bill of Rights. By this letter, and he's put this in bold, by this letter, our client puts the government on notice that it will hold the government liable for all future harm that follows from the imposition of a mandatory vaccination law. In the event that the government does pass a law to this effect, our client gives notice that it will challenge the law through judicial process, including the seeking of a declaration of incompatibility under Section 23 of the Bill of Rights. That, Mr. Speaker, is I think I've read the necessary excerpt from this letter to make the position of the Christian Association for Civics and Political Education clear. And the letter, Mr. Speaker, asserts that there are breaches or the passage of this legislation in the current form would amount to the breaches of Section 2 of the Bill of Rights, the right to life, Section 3, inhuman treatment, Section 9, private and family life, Section 10, conscience and religion, and Section 16, non-discrimination. Mr. Speaker, may I say, from my experience, any court will not hesitate to give the applicants, in this particular instance, leave to apply for judicial review. More than an arguable case is made out on the basis of what this lawyer, Mr. Rupert Wheeler, has written. And the government is on full notice that that is what is going to transpire if they proceed down this misguided road. Mr. Speaker, we have said, the leader has said, he said it in his letter, he said it publicly before that, he said it again this morning. We believe that the government will be on much better ground if they make a vaccination against the COVID-19 virus a precondition to the grant of a work permit in the first instance. Because then we would be dealing with people who would know in advance of coming to these islands what the rules are to be able to be gainfully employed. But going beyond that, as to this long list, which I will not test your patience, Mr. Speaker, of going into now, but I shall have another turn when the relevant bill comes tomorrow or whenever. But to go into that, to extend what is being proposed, that is mandatory vaccines if you want to live here, to that long list that is set out in the other piece of legislation to which I'm not allowed to refer, is, Mr. Speaker, taking it much too far. And as I said earlier in my presentation, why? What is the government seeking to achieve by doing so, given the high rate of vaccination take-up that is already the case? And that brings me, Mr. Speaker, back to the point, one of the last points that Mr. Wheeler made in his letter, which is the issue of the quarantine period for vaccinated and unvaccinated persons. Mr. Speaker, we have said over and often that reducing the quarantine period for persons who are vaccinated is illogical, irrational, and is without the benefit of any science. You don't have to have some medical degree to come to that conclusion. If the average incubation period for the virus in people is 14 days, and I say average because I have known of cases as much as 28 days, the people still testing positive. But if the average is 14 days, what purpose does a 5-day quarantine period serve, except to make the authorities feel good that those people are quarantining? But they can test negative on day 6, and when you test them on day 10 or day 14, they're positive. Over and over and over again, that has happened. And, Mr. Speaker, if they really want to know why we are dealing with this crisis we have now of community spread, they need look no further than that policy. Need look no further than that policy. Mr. Speaker, again, the logic of the government defies my understanding. If the government says that we need to get to 80% vaccination of the population, and they are so intent on that they use the upper end of the ESO estimate, which increases the number from 6 to 5 to 7 to 1. And they include people who are not eligible to get the vaccination, i.e. children under the age of 12. So we got to get 80% of the overall population, not the eligible population. So as the leader said when he spoke, we're pushing 90% of eligible people. So if that is your objective, tell me, dear Lord, why you would reduce the quarantine period for unvaccinated people before you reach the safe percentage of vaccinated people. If your objective, Mr. Speaker, is to get 80% of the overall population vaccinated, you can only reopen the borders when you reach there, because that's what you've determined is the safe number. Why then would you reduce the quarantine period for vaccinated people who we know are capable of contracting the virus, are capable of transmitting the virus notwithstanding their vaccinated status? You are asking for exactly what has happened. Community spread of the virus. And if anybody in this room, Mr. Speaker, believes that there is any hope of pulling this back, they're dreaming in color. Because the level of community spread, which is apparent from the number of students who are testing positive, is clear that we will not be able to keep this virus from spreading throughout this community. Thankfully, thank God, we have very high vaccination rates, which we can pray and hope that the vaccine does its job, works as efficaciously as all the current science indicates it does, so that most people will not get very sick, and hopefully, I pray God, no one dies. So, Mr. Speaker, that's where we are. Dr. Hazel Brown, whom I have a lot of regard for, and faith in, made it very clear in her recent statements that there is now the established spread of COVID-19 in the community. That's where we are. So why are we trying to drag people who don't want to get vaccinated into this net? What purpose is it going to serve? Mr. Speaker, remember I said this today. In another couple of weeks, public health is going to say there is no point in contact tracing anymore. The best that we can do and what we will urge is if someone tests positive, we isolate them and people close to them. They're not going to be able to, they're not going to have the resources to contact trace all of these people. This thing is increasing and spreading exponentially. Anyone who has paid any attention to the science on this and has studied this will understand this. Mr. Speaker, I cannot tell you how many hours, days, months I spent reading up on this stuff, following this stuff, every single thing that comes out. Not some of the rubbish fake news, but authoritative sources. That's the way it happens, Mr. Speaker. We have to be like the little bird that lands on the limb confidently. Not because she's confident of the strength of that limb, but because she's confident of her wings. That's where we are. We have to be confident now that the vaccine is going to do its job. All of this isolating, contact tracing and isolating, that is going to cease in another few weeks. Not that I am any prophet. I just watch and I followed what happens everywhere else. And I know a little about the resources, the amount of resources we have in terms of personnel to deal with these things. Mr. Speaker, I have heard the Premier over and again claim that he and his government are relying on the same advice that we got. I cringed every time I heard it. Mr. Speaker, the Premier and the Cabinet have a constitutional duty and responsibility to exercise their own judgment. They are the ones who are charged with the responsibility of developing and insisting on the implementation of policy. It's not the CMO, it's not the governor, it's not Travel Cayman, it's not the program board. It is the Premier and the Cabinet of this country. Mr. Speaker, in the earliest days of this crisis, and the Attorney General is well aware, the governor wished to declare a state of emergency. Mr. Speaker, had he insisted, there was nothing I could do besides talk about it, because he has that constitutional authority. But I made very plain in my most diplomatic manner, and with the learned Attorney General present, that I would not and could not support any such exercise. Why? Because the declaration of a state of emergency suspends the power of the Premier and the Cabinet and the Parliament. This responsibility during those times was mine and my government's. My people, our people elected us. And if we get it wrong, we get it wrong, and they know what to do with us. But I would never voluntarily turn over my responsibility for the welfare of my people to some program board or some CMO, however good he may or she may be. Because I and the people that serve in the cabinet with me are the ones who are constitutionally bound to exercise that responsibility. Mr. Speaker, no one who's been around these islands in the last 2 decades would be unaware of how strongly I have battled over those 2 decades to move our Constitution forward so that our own people who are elected by our people are the ones who make the key decisions that affect the quality of life and the safety and welfare of the people here. Because no one who comes from somewhere else can care more about us than us. I have lived that my entire political life. And that is why I was prepared, and I do it again, to go out on limbs, even if no one was following me, to make sure that we retained the elected government responsibility for the welfare of our people. So, Mr. Speaker, it is not enough to say, the devil made me do it, the program board made me do it, somebody else made me do it. You are responsible as the Premier and the Cabinet for what transpires in these matters. Take the responsibility, wear it, and do your best. Mr. Speaker, I pray every night that this government succeeds. I do not want them to fail, because if they fail, my country fails. They may have to, the Premier may have to worry about other people wanting his position. But you don't have to worry about Alden McLaughlin. He did it for 8 years. He don't want it again. So, Mr. Speaker, all I have ever wanted, which is what led me into politics at the age of 39, when I should, many people have said, been sitting in a law firm, making a pile of money, was my love and care for the people, my people in this country. That has been my motivating factor my entire political life. And until, Mr. Speaker, I draw my last breath, that will be what I want to do. My very best in whatever role I play following the next elections, should I live that long. None of us know how long we're going to live. So, Mr. Speaker, I shall stop there. But before I do so, I will appeal to the members on the other side of the House not to view the position that those who have protested this issue in many fora, some who are still here this afternoon, sticking it out, not to view this as people wishing to give the government the devil. No, Mr. Speaker. We want, all of us, Mr. Speaker, we want to ensure that only the best endures for our people. Mr. Speaker, we fought awfully hard to get a constitution with a Bill of Rights. If you'll excuse me one moment, Mr. Speaker, I've lost one of my pieces of paper. What am I folder? Oh, right in front of me. Mr. Speaker, all of us, and I mean all of us, including those on the other side of the House, because as I said before, I've been in all of those positions. The only one I haven't held in this House is that of Speaker. So none of us, Mr. Speaker, want anything but good. We fought very hard to get a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights that would allow the people of this country to stand up and say, no, Mr. Government, you cannot do that. That is oppressive. I am guaranteed this particular right, this particular freedom. Mr. Speaker, if we start down that slippery slope of breaching these important, fundamental, not important, fundamental human rights, that, Mr. Speaker, will be the beginning of the end of our democracy. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to finish with a very solemn poem by Martin it's German, Niemöller, or Müller, probably Niemöller. I have no German. And Mr. Speaker, it was written based on his experiences in the Second World War. He said, first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was no one left to speak up for me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The public gallery has been told that you cannot applaud. Please follow those guidelines. Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Last call. Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the mover for his right of reply. The Honorable, the Deputy Premier, the Minister of Border Control.
Mr. Speaker, Martin Luther King said it best when he said, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? Amen. And there comes a time when a man must take a stand that is neither safe, politic, or popular. But he must take a stand because his conscience tells him he is right. Mr. Speaker, I'll be the first to say, like, remember from Red Bay, I didn't get much sleep, and I want to go on record for thanking the member for Red Bay for such a fine performance that actually kept me awake the entire time. As I said to him during the lunch break, I actually enjoy listening to him. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I went as far as to say to him that one of the best speeches that he had put down in this very parliament was the speech that he gave the morning of the Domestic Partnership Bill. And while the vote did not go his way, I still regard it as a very good speech. And Mr. Speaker, as I listened to the member from Red Bay, I really wish he had shown up, or that person or that side of him had shown up when he was premier for 8 years in this country, when we had many challenges, Mr. Speaker. It is rather ironic, Mr. Speaker, that discrimination has existed in this country for so long against Caymanians, that every single time we are required to put our foot down where Caymanians are concerned, it becomes an issue. And it is ironic, Mr. Speaker, that I look at many of our young people today that can't find any employment, and we are told that it is the failings of our education system. But yet, Mr. Speaker, when these same young people go overseas and are educated in universities in North America and Europe, they come back and still can't find a job. And they're going to tell us that those people are not being discriminated against. I have yet to see one public demonstration, one protest, or anyone standing firm with regards to that where our young people are concerned. Mr. Speaker, I want to start. I made a few little notes here. The Honorable Leader of the Opposition, member for Georgetown East, had said that, you know, the opposition was not receiving any updates from public health. I am sure the Honorable Leader of the Opposition would recognize that the civil service and elsewhere, Section 55 of the Constitution is the government's prerogative, but we will ask that the relevant government officials provide the members of the opposition with any update that they require, for the simple fact, Mr. Speaker, like us, regardless of where they sit in this parliament, also represent people. The Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, also went on to make reference to listening to all the activity on the social media chat. I can say to him, Mr. Speaker, that having spent 4 years in opposition compared to his 5 months thus far, I can say to anyone in this house, if you think you can run a country by listening to social media, you're sadly mistaken. Most of the members, at least all of the members in the opposition, Mr. Speaker, have been on this side of the aisle, and they know the difficult position that comes from sitting on this side. Equally, I understand how opposition members think, and again, they're doing their job, and I don't want anyone to really take them to task for doing their job. It is what is required. The Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, also made reference to investor saying that he's looking to close down and liquidate his business if this bill is passed. I would like to be the first one to say that I know a group of young Caymanians that have been looking for a possible business venture to probably invest in and start owning a piece of the Caymanian rock and start owning more commerce in Cayman. And if that investor chooses to close down and liquidate, I know a group of young people right now that is willing to start taking ownership of businesses again in Cayman. So I would like to have the name of that investor after the vote so we can put them in touch with those young people. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition also mentioned that this debate is now us versus them. I would ask him for the record, if that is the case and that is his belief, which side is he choosing to stand on? Will he be standing with us, or will he be standing with them? I would really like that to be clarified, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too like a good bedtime story. And while Alice in Wonderland was never one of my favorites, and I was hoping that the member for Red Bay would at least give me a Nancy story, or even a little Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, or even the Wizard of Oz, to directly say, no, everybody knows Dorothy isn't in Kansas anymore. But it is rather ironic, Mr. Speaker, that as I was listening to the member for Red Bay, I realized at one point he was actually reading the wrong bill. And I couldn't help, and I want to thank my member from the Minister for Tourism for pointing that out. And I think maybe if he had spent more time reading the bill as opposed to Alice in Wonderland, he would have seen that there are many things in the bill that he was complaining about that we have actually already filed as an amendment. We have already made it perfectly clear, Mr. Speaker, and I'll say it again for the record, that all dependents of Caymanians and anyone that links to Caymanians are being exempted from the bill. He goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, that we knew passing this bit of legislation, it would be challenged. Mr. Speaker, the member for Red Bay.
Mr. Speaker.
The member for Red Bay, arising on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, which bill are we, is the minister speaking to? There are no exemptions from the ones that we have.
So I don't understand the point of order, though. I think the minister can say that he's replying to the debate. And I think that's what he's doing.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to make a big thing about this, but the minister did say that had I spent more time reading the bill rather than reading Alice in Wonderland, I would have known what was in the bill. But there are no exemptions. None of the exemptions he just spoke about are in either of these bills that I have here. So I'm just wondering which ones these are.
They were distributed. They were distributed. The amendments that we filed were distributed.
I think what the minister said was that there are certain things that you complained about that he has put forward amendments for.
That is correct. Yeah, but I filed it before you complained, Mr. Speaker. But anyway,
I think the minister can continue.
Listen. Can you make sure the honourable member for Red Bay get a copy of the amendments that were filed before we started this morning, please? Because I realize it probably threw off their entire debate, where they probably didn't get a chance to look at those amendments. So we could have saved a lot of time this morning. I thought they were distributed too. Yeah. And then, Mr. Speaker, again, and you see, this is the beauty about this for the listening public, is that whenever someone is getting on a roll, the rules is that you get up, you pull something to kind of take them off the track. But don't worry, I made my notes so I can continue.
Honourable Minister, just to try to find out, have those amendments been distributed? They have. I thought we took the time this morning to distribute them. Please continue, Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if I can clarify. Shortly before the debate began, copies of what are described as notice of committee stage amendments were circulated to members on this side. But that's not what the minister said, Mr. Speaker. He said, had I taken the time to read the bills? Mr. Speaker, they've given us only 10 days to deal with this, fine. But to give us a few minutes before we start the debate, which we prepared for in advance, is a tad unreasonable. I'm sure you will agree, sir.
Honourable
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, I learned from the best. I told the former premier at the time, I said if there's one politician I studied as a new legislator, it was actually him. So I just want to state that for the record, my appreciation for his teachings, Mr. Speaker. Oh, listen, I have mad respect for the member for Red Bay. I just want to state that for the record. Mr. Speaker, It's kind of ironic because one of the things that you will appreciate in politics is the coulda, woulda, shoulda. What it would have been like if we were there or have an idea. Mr. Speaker, where did I put that? 1 second. I didn't think I would have needed it, but let's see if I can find it here, Mr. Speaker. 1 second. So much different papers around here. Take it. 1 second, Mr. Speaker. Found it. Can you give this to the speaker for me, please? And it was delivered in this house already. Mr. Speaker, this was a statement that was issued in this Parliament last December by the former Premier and now member for Red Bay. I think it may probably be in the public domain. I don't know if you want to get copies to the members or...
Strictly under the rules, it has been published, and therefore you can continue, but in a matter of courtesy, I'll get copies.
Yeah, because it was issued, it was said in this house already.
Yes.
Okay.
It's in the record,
Yeah,
published
it's in the record.
here.
Yeah.
But we will still get copies just to help members refresh their memory.
Yeah, and actually it'd be good to give them a copy also, Mr. Speaker, because this was actually a statement that was issued by the former Premier when he sat where the current Premier now sits. And one of the things he was speaking about, Mr. Speaker, was the reduction in quarantine days, basically being illogical and possibly the reason for maybe the community spread and everything. But I just want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that at that time, when the Premier was speaking about, the former Premier, I should say, was speaking about the vaccines arriving in Cayman and the possible Christmas gift that we were receiving, he went on the second page, and he says, and this is the section that deals with the following restrictions would apply for people arriving from overseas. But, Mr. Speaker, before getting into that, just getting straight into that, I wanted to see what, for the record, what was proposed at the time. And it says the following restriction would apply for people arriving from overseas. A, all travelers entering the islands with evidence of having received an approved vaccine course against SARS-CoV-2, which should have been completed before arrival, as according to public health recommendation, and a negative PCR test upon arrival will be exempted from quarantine as per Section 5 of Control of COVID-19, Number 3, Regulations 2020, if living in accommodation where other residents eligible for vaccination have also received the vaccine. B, travelers who do not meet the requirements will need to go into mandatory quarantine and be tested according to the requirements at the time. C, all people who are exempted from quarantine in this manner, including their households, will undergo repeat testing on day 5, day 10, and day 15 following their arrival date. D, regular PCR screening will continue with safety restrictions for healthcare workers, healthcare establishment, nursing homes and prisons. And E, those involved in hosting travelers, including all port workers, hotel workers, restaurants, bar workers, leisure companies, taxi drivers, and anyone else working in tourism will be required to be screened for COVID-19 disease at regular intervals. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I don't think he meant that he was doing away with quarantine completely because someone was just vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, and this letter is too wrong, this statement that he gave in the House, Mr. Speaker, is 3 pages long, and I really hope the members of the opposition all receive a copy of it to directly see what was being proposed by the then Premier when he was in this seat. Mr. Speaker, many of the stuff inside here, except doing away with quarantine, is same advice that was given to the previous government, is given to this government, that we're also following. And if you look at this statement, Mr. Speaker, carefully, you will see that many of the things that are being proposed today, minus doing away with the quarantine for people who are vaccinated, this government is exactly following. So I cannot understand. We cannot understand, Mr. Speaker, why all of a sudden it is now a different position being taken. But again, I do understand that we are now in a different role, and he has a responsibility and a duty as a member of the opposition. Mr. Speaker, the member for Red Bay also made a note that the law will be challenged. Again, Mr. Speaker, the member for Red Bay of all people knows that the Parliament itself is separate from the courts, and the courts also have a role to play in our democracy. Similar as we have had previous bills before, none more controversial than the Domestic Partnership Bill, where it was already announced even before the bill came that it would have been challenged. The government still went through at the time and carried through. I say all of that to say, Mr. Speaker, you can't run a country, you can't run a government, and you can't run a parliament based on the fact that you think whatever laws you pass are going to be challenged. This is not how our system of democracy works. Mr. Speaker, the member for Red Bay also made several references to the European Convention on Human Rights. Mr. Speaker, I will ask the member for Red Bay to take a look at exactly what is happening in Europe, where many Europeans are actually being compelled by law to be vaccinated in certain situations. In none of the bills that we are proposing, not one single Caymanian is required to take any vaccine on a mandatory basis. None. Zero, zilch, nada, none. Even members who have PR that are applying for status, this does not apply to them. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm a bit lost, other than the fact that this is politics as usual, and I get it. I get it. I understand it. Like I said, I'm only 5 months removed from being in opposition, so I kind of understand where they're coming from. It's still fresh in my mind. They have their job to do, they're doing it, and that's fine. But, Mr. Speaker, while we are entitled to our own opinions, we are not entitled to our own facts. Mr. Speaker, to give credit where credit is due, the first time that COVID was mentioned in this Parliament, it was done on Friday, January 31st, by the previous Minister of Health, the Honorable Dwayne Seymour. Give credit where credit is due, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the 3rd of February, he had a press conference. Beside him was Mr. Gary Wong from CBC, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Samuels. Nobody else. And the minister came out to update this island that the first reported death outside of China happened in the Philippines over the weekend. And at that time, we were looking at 266 deaths globally. By March, we were past the 40,000 mark. A year later, we were almost at 2 million. Today, we're at 4.8 million. Mr. Speaker, for too long, the people in this country have been living in a bubble. This legislation has already passed in Turks and Caicos for both work permit holders and PR holders. Not one protest. You know why, Mr. Speaker? The people in Turks and Caicos have seen firsthand how serious and how dangerous this COVID pandemic is, because they have had local deaths. Not one protest in Turks and Caicos. Not one. We have been living in a bubble for so long, and people of this country will not take this serious enough until we go to a funeral for somebody that we know that have died from COVID.
Member, for information purposes of the public gallery, and beginning this morning, I intimated protocols that are in place. I know the police, who's here as security, is having a difficulty with some people refusing to wear the mask. As long as you are in this building, you have to wear your mask. I know it's difficult. As you can see, I keep shifting mine. It fogs my glasses. I keep shifting, but you have to do it. If you cannot do it, then I suggest you leave the building. I say there are no cameras, no laptops, and no cell phones to be utilized except by the press. Please follow our protocols. Thank you kindly. That I had to make that intervention at this time.
That's okay, Mr. Speaker. I completely understand. Mr. Speaker, we are in a position, and while this government was criticized for using the upper population number, one of the other underlying reasons, Mr. Speaker, why we decided to be overly cautious is that we are also recognized that included in that count is many people who have also left the island. I can tell you that my son was also vaccinated here locally. He's now no longer in the country. He's away at university. My daughter was also vaccinated. She's away at university. My sister was vaccinated. She's locally here. She's back in the UK. And the very film crew that was here earlier this year, Mr. Speaker, all vaccinated and all left. So even though we're talking about this number being of that, we also do recognize that there are many people who have gotten vaccinated and have also left. And again, Mr. Speaker, when we started out, we were told that the 80% of 71,000 was almost impossible. Mr. Speaker, the Caymanian people have proven time and time again that when it's time to be counted, they can be counted on. And 78% of the people who was here at the time, and whether they're here now or have gone or whatever, have said, you know what? We are going to do our responsible thing. Mr. Speaker, we are not talking about an economic situation, because businesses can rebuild. We're not talking about a traffic matter or something. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about people's lives. This is what this bill is about. And Mr. Speaker, let me break it down simple for many people to understand. At present, barring the social distancing, the mask wearing, and the hygiene steps, the two primary defenses that we have against this COVID-19 pandemic is vaccine and quarantine. Mr. Speaker, we are being, like yourself and many others, pushing to rejoin the global community, where we want to reopen tourism, we want to reopen ourselves back to the world, and we're looking to do away with the requirement for many people to quarantine. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, if we're going to do away with quarantine, to reopen this country, we need to make sure that the one primary defense that we have, which is vaccination, is one of the most robust in the world. Mr. Speaker, we are trying to do what no country that has reopened have successfully done. Amen. We are trying to make sure that when we do, we would have learned from the mistakes of Turks and Caicos. We would have learned from the mistakes of Bermuda. We would have learned from the mistakes of St. Kitts. We would have learned from the mistakes of Israel. We would have learned from the mistakes in Jamaica to make sure we get this right and protect Caymanian lives. Mr. Speaker, we recognize that there are people in this community that cannot, for medical reasons, be vaccinated. We accept that there are people in this community that because of their age cannot be vaccinated. And Mr. Speaker, we accept that there are people for their own personal belief cannot be vaccinated. But we in this parliament have a responsibility to all of those Caymanians. And it is our job as a government to make sure that the infrastructure that we put in place is robust enough to take care of them, regardless of whether they can get vaccinated or not, regardless of their medical condition. We owe that to them. And for every single Caymanian that don't want to get vaccinated, that is their right. And that is why we're supporting nothing for any mandatory vaccination for Caymanians, because this is their home. They have nowhere else to go. But for every single person else coming in this country that don't have a need to be here, if they've got to come here, they've got to be vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, no one is complaining when we said we only wanted vaccinated tourists. We only wanted vaccinated guests. So all of a sudden, if a person is coming to work and they're a guest worker, that don't apply to them. Are they still not a guest? For a person just passing through, even if they're staying there for several months, maybe who own a condo or something, aren't they still just a guest? I mean, when do we start in this country putting guests on the same footing as we put Caymanians? Joe Biden has just turned around and said, you cannot come to the United States to shop, go to Disney World, or do anything that you want unless you're vaccinated. Not a soul complained. Why don't they go and tell Joe Biden he can't do that? But no, only in the Cayman Islands, that the minute you put something down that only Caymanians alone will benefit, it becomes a problem in this country. Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Minister, we have reached the hour of 4:30. Honorable Premier, can we have the suspension of Standing Order 10-2?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 that the business of the House will continue beyond 4:30. Thank you.
Question is, the standing orders be suspended in order for the business of the House to continue after the hour of 4:30. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The business continues. Honorable Minister, continuing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if this is a preview of what is to come, I'm going to serve notice now, Mr. Speaker. Because while the members of the opposition refer to me as the Minister of Finance, I also want to let them know that I'm also the Minister for Border Control and Labor. And when you see the changes that will be coming to the point system and to other changes to the immigration law that will make sure that Caymanians assume their rightful place and return to their rightful place in this country, I can tell you, save your fighting for that time, because that legislation is coming. We in this House have a responsibility to every single Caymanian. We have a responsibility to take care of them. Mr. Speaker, eons ago, when people created governments, they created with three primary purposes: to protect their life, to protect their liberty, and to protect their property. But the preservation of life comes first. And while I accept that this is very difficult for many people to comprehend, I'm going to ask them to also accept one thing. If you want something you never had, you have to do something you never did. We cannot make the same mistakes that everybody else made and then think that because our vaccination rate is X, this is what it's going to be. It does not work like that. We're talking about the preservation of life, which is first and foremost. Mr. Speaker, I have received the generic email that was going around asking people to send to their MPs, speaking about the curated balance between expats and Caymanians and how we're looking to destroy that fabric. Mr. Speaker, has anyone taken a look to see the cost of land in this country? Anybody look to see all the land banking that's going on in this country? Anybody look to see the housing crisis in this country? What balance are they talking about, Mr. Speaker? Are they speaking to the same people that I'm speaking to? Mr. Speaker, I'll be the first to tell anybody, and people have said to me, you know, Chris, why don't you get up, or the government get up, and challenge the anti-vaxxers and all of these people? Mr. Speaker, our Bill of Rights give them that right, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with it. That's their right. And we can't be sitting down and directing government resources against people expressing their free will. That is something I support. Many people have fought for the people to get that right, and I will be the first to defend their right to say whatever they want to say, even if I disagree with it. But, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about science, and yes, the member for Red Bay is right. A lot of stuff is still unknown. Last December, what do you know today he didn't know now? He was willing to bring in people, according to his own statement. Once you're vaccinated, didn't even want to quarantine. That's the information he had then. I'm sure back then that was the best decision that was being made based on the advice he received. I'm sure if you ask him today, no, he'll tell you something different. That's how this system works. We work with the information we have, and we make decisions based on the information we have. And hindsight is always 20/20. We can always look back, and we can say, well, it should have gone this way, we should have gone that way. But the only true judge of management of this pandemic, Mr. Speaker, is how many funerals we don't go. But, Mr. Speaker, I will say this much. While I'm not sure how many people will die from COVID if we reopen, I can tell you this much. The mental anguish that thousands of Caymanian families are experiencing because of this cannot continue. Parents right now are worried that they may go another Christmas without seeing their children being able to come home if we maintain the quarantine. The impact that that is having on people and businesses, it cannot continue. So if we are to reopen, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have to reopen safely, and more importantly, we'll have to do something that nobody else have done before, which is to make sure that every single person that comes into this country is vaccinated. It is that simple. You want freedom of choice? The choice is simple. You can come here if you're vaccinated, and if you're not vaccinated, you can go someplace else. But we are not prepared, Mr. Speaker, as a government, to take around 18 months of where the Caymanian people have endured lockdown, name days, can't go to the beach and all of that, just so we can just flood the mile now with 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 guest workers, guest visitors, or guest residents, or guest investors, whatever guests you want to call them. This is what we're talking about. And, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, what was the change in position for me in this? When we went out and we had the first incident in Northside and they did the contact tracing, do you know when they did the contact tracing? You want to talk about the real test of what the number represents? Do you know how many people was actually vaccinated when they did the contact tracing? 60%. The first time we were tested and we went through the contact tracing, only 60% of the people, our own Caymanian people, were actually vaccinated. Thus, again, the reason why, Mr. Speaker, this government needed to make the hard decision of making sure that every single person that comes inside here is vaccinated. Because when push came to shove, only 60% of our people in Northside at that time, due to contact tracing, was actually vaccinated. And I'm sure the members of the opposition will agree that 60% is an unacceptable number. Do we know how many people have received first dose, second dose, that are even still on island, Mr. Speaker? We don't know. Thus, the reason we need to be extra careful. As I said, Mr. Speaker, our goal here is to make sure that we do not attend funerals, first and foremost, for our people. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we have got to reopen our borders. People are mentally drained. We see it. We see the fatigue. Thank God for Cayman Brack. Thank God for Little Cayman. When people just needed to get off the rock. They just need a change of scenery. That is what we are about. So, Mr. Speaker, I accept that for many people in opposition, they can't see through this. And I get that. But what I'm asking them to do is this. Open your mind and accept one undistinguishable fact. If we in the Cayman Islands is to do this, reopen successfully, we have to do things that other countries have never done, taking approaches that other countries have not done, because every single country that is about to embark on what we have done had to close back down. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, there are many Caymanians right now that also don't want us to reopen because they fear we may end up canceling Christmas. The last thing for them is a lockdown during Christmas. They're already seeing the adjustment going back to wearing masks, social distancing after being in a bubble for so long. But we are talking about people's lives. We have seen, Mr. Speaker, when the vaccination, when we had that little outbreak, when we had that outbreak the other day, starting in Northside, we have seen the importance of vaccination. We have seen how the viral load may change from here to there or whatever, between a person vaccinated or unvaccinated or different underlying issues and so forth. But one thing is certain, Mr. Speaker, vaccination works. The other day in Boston, a couple of years back, anti-vaxxers went crazy over the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. Told people they didn't need it for their children. You had a big breakout. They had to get the rate back up to 90%. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? Our Constitution allows people, whether they want to believe the earth is flat, whether they want to believe vaccination work, it allows them to have that opinion. But what it don't allow them to have, Mr. Speaker, is to have opinion that may also endanger the general public. The greater good must always prevail. And Mr. Speaker, because we do recognize, and because this government does not want any Caymanian to be forced to be vaccinated, we then make it a bigger priority to make sure that everybody that we bring around them and their families are vaccinated. This is a responsible thing to do. And you know, Mr. Speaker, when we're in opposition, We had many differences with how certain things were managed, but we took the decision. I haven't seen what has even happened in the United States between red states and blue states, Republicans and Democrats, science versus non-science, and all of that kind of stuff. We were not going to play politics with this issue. And I would like to say we did a good job at it. There are many things that we could have done different. Mr. Speaker, I go back to Finance Committee in November 2019. The Honorable Leader of the Opposition was in the chair. The Ministry of Health was being questioned. We asked for a break. We went inside the Misani room, and the former member for East End, then Leader of the Opposition, Ard McLean, said, gentlemen, we got a problem. All these questions we want to ask, we can't ask. Because the minister at the time was still feeling his own, and the acting chief of the time was fairly new. And we said, you know what? We're not going to ask the difficult questions, even though it was our right. Because our fear at that time was asking questions that couldn't be answered, and the public, and undermine the public confidence in the Ministry of Health. There are some things that in this country is bigger than politics. Several months later, that was the best decision that was ever made, because the country then looked to the leadership in the Ministry of Health and its underlying departments and statutory authorities to guide this country through one of the worst disasters or pandemic since the Spanish flu more than 100 years ago. That is responsible opposition. Mr. Speaker, equally, the Minister of Finance will tell you, barring questions on Sinaco, whenever the Ministry of Finance came up, we block voted everything. That is a responsible thing to do. To sit down now and question the very people who have done such a good job, so much so that one of them even got an MBE, to say that the advice they're giving us now, while we listen to it, we must make the decision. That's true. And we have listened to the advice, and this is the decision. And you know what? The Honorable Minister of Health is right. Former Minister of Health is right. Mr. Speaker, I said earlier, and I'll say it again for the record, the first time in this Parliament when nobody was even looking at COVID, it was the member for Borden East, the Minister of Health at the time, that got up and made the statement. The Monday, he was all alone by himself at the press conference. CBC Director, member Gary Wong with him, Dr. Lee and Dr. Samuels. And as soon as the thing blew up, everybody and the auntie was out there now to come get their 15 minutes when the minister alone started out all there on his own. But you know what, Minister, for the record, on behalf of the people of Barton West, I want to say a big thank you. If I've never publicly said that to you before, I want to say that to you now. You started it when you were all by yourself. And on behalf of the government on this side, and the Premier just had mentioned it to me, to extend it, on behalf of the government and the people of the Cayman Islands, I want to thank you. Well, we talk about the OBE if we can talk about, no, listen, we must learn in this country to celebrate our own. When they're ready to attack him, they attack him. When he do good, they must give him good too. Because that is what is missing in this country and missing in our politics. We can't be nice to nobody. But Mr. Speaker, thank you, the member for West Bay North. I accept, Mr. Speaker, and the government accept, and I'll be the first to tell the general public that this issue, even on our side, was an emotive one. Thus the reason for the amendments, where we decided, and I can tell you, as even to move of the bill, I said to my colleagues, after we published the bill and spoken to people, I thought about it. If a Caymanian decided that they want to marry an anti-vaxxer, that is their right to do so. And whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated, that is not our job as a government to tell them otherwise. Because that is the right of a Caymanian to his own family to do what it is he wants in his own country. But, let me say that again, in his own country or in her own country. The irony, Mr. Speaker, that same privilege has not been extended to Caymanians who are now marrying Americans. Because you know what? Biden tell them, you better be vaccinated. It doesn't make a difference. That's the difference between us and them. So, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition said, it appears that this bill is coming down to us and them. I respectfully disagree. I think it's about either whether we save lives or we don't save lives. But if he wants it to be a bill between us and them, I will tell you right now, I choose us. Okay? So, Mr. Speaker, I will tell you right now, as I said when I started out, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? There are no cowards on this side of the aisle. Expediency asks the question, is it politic? There's not an expedient here, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you just up to very last night, at around 9:30 something, I had a very tearful exchange with members of my own caucus on a Sunday night. Vanity asks the question, is it popular? Mr. Speaker, we know that there's nothing popular about this. But difficult decisions are never popular. Leadership is never popular. But conscience asks the question, is it right? And Mr. Speaker, one thing I give the credit to the Premier for, every single decision that comes out of caucus that goes to Cabinet, every single member is allowed to speak. And there are times when we agree on something, then we get called back to a meeting because information has changed, and we go back over the process again based on information that I've received. Every single member on this side knows the challenges that comes with leadership. In such a short time, we have been tested. And I really and truly want to thank the members of the opposition for doing their good jobs over there. Because on this side, we do have a lot of new members, but they're hungry, they're driven, and they love this country. And they're getting a crash course in politics that none better than the presentation that was delivered by the member for Red Bay and the former Premier. That I can tell you, if he was like that when I was here the first time, I would have joined him too. But, Mr. Speaker, this is what government is about. It is not doing what is popular. It is not doing what is safe. It is not doing what is politic. It is doing what is right. And for the many people on work permits, I really do hope they understand. I saw a statement by Jamaican Prime Minister that made me cringe, where he basically said at some point, the unvaccinated people will be on their own. You know, I see references were made that this bill is being done because of the Jamaicans don't want to get vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, nobody in this parliament has got more licks to being Jamaican than me. Mr. Speaker, all of a sudden, people have forgotten about the visas that was basically put on Jamaicans. People have forgotten about all the different stuff, as Budgie would say, everything are going far in a yard to get the blame. They've forgotten all of that. And all of a sudden, everybody's a defender of Jamaicans. When you yourself did the mass status grant, that many Jamaicans that wouldn't have gotten it, got it. Where did the challenge come from, Mr. Speaker? All of a sudden, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask every member of this House, as leaders in this country, we have a lot of differences on a lot of issues. Please, let this not be one of them. This is about the preservation of life. And if we can't agree on this one issue, then where does the maturity in our politics come from? Is it going to be one man up ship all the way? Is this the example that we want to leave for our children? Mr. Speaker, I'm entering my second term, and I'm grateful to the people of Barton West for giving me this opportunity. And I'm grateful to the Premier and my colleagues to place in me the responsibility for Minister for Border Control and Labor. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it is probably the most challenging ministry because it deals with immigration, customs, pensions, work, you name it. But what makes my job easier, Mr. Speaker, is that as long as I'm doing something that is in the best interest of Caymanians, then I'm fine. We have a lot of issues to deal with in this country. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, as a Caymanian, while I do respect many people's right to protest, because that is their right, I am disappointed for some of the people I see and some of the things that have been said. Where is the anger for our own people who don't have opportunities in this country? Mr. Speaker, I have personally said to people in the hotel industry, had you hired more Caymanians in the hotels, more Caymanian voters would have been beating on our doors to reopen. But no, it is not the Caymanian voters that is beating on our doors. A lot of them are actually on the cruise tourism side, which has to continue. So, Mr. Speaker, I get all the human rights issue, and we were already threatened before we embark on this that we would have been sued. And actually, Mr. Speaker, it was actually that threat of a lawsuit where the bill went as far-reaching as it did to protect what it is that we're doing in the court of law, to make sure. What was actually being proposed by the opposition, we already was advised it could not work and it could not stand because you're actually creating two sets of people within the same people. And when we go to the more substantive bill, the Honorable Attorney General will actually speak to that with regard to the legal. And I personally am looking forward to it, to see a seasoned QC versus a newly appointed QC, to hear what their views would be. So, Mr. Speaker, this is not about Alice in Wonderland. This is about what is best for Cayman. And I can tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, difficult as this may be, and seeing the community spread, especially amongst those in schools, I am even more forthright to make sure that everybody who can get vaccinated can get vaccinated. Oh, I got plenty more, Premier, don't worry. Can get vaccinated. We need to protect our children that can't be vaccinated because of their age. We need to protect our own Caymanians that for medical reasons can't be vaccinated. And we also need to protect the Caymanians who do not believe in vaccination, but this is still their home. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill, simple as you see it, all it was asking for is that people applying for student visas and people applying for a work permit granted by Cabinet be vaccinated. And even that in itself, for student visas, is a problem. Caymanian kids can't go to school overseas unless without being vaccinated. Many Caymanians had to travel, even some of them had to come home to get the vaccination to go back. And even that is a problem in this country. This bill, student visas, and people applying for cabinet for a grant. You know, that's all this bill is. And we hear everything under the sun, all our motive being impugned and everything. For student visas, Mr. Speaker, seriously? All of this? I even had to go back and check the bill a couple of times well to see if we're still talking about the same bill. We actually put this one up front thinking it would have been much easier. And if this is what is to come, I guarantee you, Premier, don't worry, I have enough material. Because if you think that I have not gone through every single press conference that I could have, tell you the first one was on the 3rd of February, and it lasted 36 minutes too. I went back and I watched all of them. And oh, Mr. Speaker, don't worry. We have a lot of time. That's the reason I could even tell the minister who was on the press conference with him when he was there all by himself on the 3rd of February. And I even had his speech before. And the fact that they could even pull this up too, Mr. Speaker, you have no idea. So we're going to have some fun when the real bill comes up. And then we'll say exactly who is for us and who is for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is that a bill shortly entitled the Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill 2021 be given a second reading. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against?
No.
The ayes have it.
Could we have a thing, Mr. Speaker?
A division clerk.
Please.
Mr. Speaker, I call for a division.
Yes, I know you did, and I called the clerk to divide.
Honorable Wayne Panton.
Aye.
Honorable Christopher Saunders.
Yes.
Honorable Kenneth Bryan.
Aye.
Honorable Sabrina Turner.
Aye.
Honorable Johanny Ebanks.
Aye.
Honorable Andre Ebanks.
Aye.
Honorable Bernie Bush.
Aye.
Honorable Juliana O'Connor Connolly.
Aye.
Miss Heather Bodden.
Aye.
Mr. Isaac Rankin. Honorable Catherine Ebanks Wilkes. Honorable Roy McTaggart.
No.
Mr. Joseph Hugh.
No.
Mr. Dwayne Seymour.
No.
Mr. Moses Kirkconnell.
No.
Miss Barbara Connolly.
No.
Honorable Alden McLaughlin.
No.
Mr. David White.
No.
Results of the division, 11 ayes, 7 noes. The bill, the Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill 2021 has been given a second reading.
Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021.
The Honorable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I rise to move a motion for the second reading of a bill entitled the Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021.
The bill has been duly moved. Does the Honorable Premier speaking thereto?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Will the Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is an honor today to be speaking in support of the Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021. Mr. Speaker, this bill represents the full growth of the seed of an idea that was planted, I think, during the administration of 2013 to 2017, when I was a minister at the time. During that time, the administration in which I was involved set out our intention to convert the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service Joint Marine Unit into the Cayman Islands Coast Guard, and provided that it would be given the training and the resources necessary to enable them to better detect and interdict vessels arriving in Cayman's waters with drugs, guns, and illegal immigrants. It was also envisioned then that the Coast Guard, Mr. President, would serve as a training ground for our young people to once again become interested in pursuing long and rewarding maritime careers. So this was to create the structure around what was the Joint Marine Unit and its conversion into a Coast Guard that would serve all of these appropriate and necessary law enforcement purposes. And I'm honored to be able to stand here today as Premier to table this bill and support this in consideration of making it an official act. Mr. Speaker, I am confident, I hope it is not misplaced, that this bill will enjoy the support on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Speaker, I wish to give credit to the members of the opposition for seeing through the formation of the Coast Guard when they sat as government. And it is only unfortunate that they were unable to bring this bill before this Honourable House prior to the elections in April of this year. Mr. Speaker, our now modern Coast Guard is steeped in a long, varied and colorful tapestry of history, of those who rose up to serve and protect the people of the Cayman Islands, starting with the militia, in the late 1700s to the Home Guard in the mid-20th century during World War II, to the various ranks of the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service today. And in that significant amount of time, the need for a group of people to protect our islands from everything from rogue pirates, sorry, one second. And regional threats of world wars has expanded to include modern menaces to our shores and our people. Mr. Speaker, the establishment of a Coast Guard for the Cayman Islands represents a very key aspect of strengthening capacity and resiliency in the areas of maritime security, border control, and public safety. As I said previously, the country has historically and continually pursued advances in policy with a view to building local capacity and capability necessary to effectively keep pace with an evolving catalog of risks, threats, and service demands as well across a broad spectrum of maritime security, safety, and rescue. The strategic policy statement to establish and operate a Coast Guard as a unique entity of the Cayman Islands government, separate from the Royal Cayman Islands Police, is a significant achievement with respect to maturation of Cayman's national resilience. I commend the Commissioner of Police for taking the Coast Guard under his wing while this bill was being drafted. Until this bill is fully enacted, the Coast Guard's work will continue to be conducted under the auspices of the RCIPS Joint Marine Unit. And our men and women of the Coast Guard will perform their duties as special constables instead of officers of the Coast Guard. Working along with members of the RCIPS, our Coast Guard officers have already been providing support in maritime search and rescue, marine law enforcement, and helping to preserve the safety and security of our borders. Once this bill is passed, Mr. Speaker, they will be transitioned over with the full authority under the new Act, as they rightly should be. I'd like to commend, in addition, Mr. Speaker, Coast Guard Commander Robert Scotland and Lieutenant Commander Leo Anglin, who have had operational control over the Coast Guard over the past 3 years and have played a pivotal role in the development of this bill, even while working assiduously to establish the organization. I am pleased to confirm that both of these distinguished gentlemen, two distinguished Caymanian gentlemen, will continue in their respective and respected duties. In fact, Mr. Speaker, our first cohort of Coast Guard recruits, which included 10 men and 6 women, graduated in March. And since then, they've been instrumental in a vast range of duties, some of which have been rescuing trapped turtles, providing support to Cuban migrant-related matters, helping rescue 2 Jamaican fishermen lost at sea, assisting with weekend patrols to address antisocial behavior, and recovering drugs from our waters. Most impressively, Mr. Speaker, they have taken their rightful place amongst the other uniformed branches and formed up in March during the Queen's birthday parade in June of this year. It was a particularly poignant time to see them participating in that event, sir. Mr. Speaker, the creation of the Cayman Islands Coast Guard has modernized Cayman's overall approach to maritime safety, security, and enforcement by bringing our islands into conformity with a series of international obligations. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the timeliness of the passage of this bill improves our readiness improves our readiness for the upcoming International Maritime Organization's III Compliance Code audit, which will take place later this month. The Cayman Islands Coast Guard will play a critical role in some of the key areas covered by the audit, especially search and rescue operations. The Coast Guard will help to achieve further reductions in crime by giving our islands a significantly enhanced maritime capacity and capability, ensuring safe use of our waters for recreational and commercial vessels, and improving the competence and professionalism of our response capability for maritime search and rescue. Mr. Speaker, this bill establishes the Coast Guard as a uniformed and disciplined department of government responsible for the maritime enforcement of local laws relating to ensuring the preservation of the safety and security of the islands, and the coordination and delivery of all maritime search and rescue responses within the territorial seas of the islands and the island's internationally agreed search and rescue region. The bill also ensures compliance with applicable international law, conventions, and treaties related to ensuring the safety of life at sea, as well as pollution prevention, the enforcement of local laws, and any applicable international laws, conventions, or treaties addressing the prevention, detection, and disruption of illicit activities on the high seas. What this bill does not do, Mr. Speaker, importantly, is permit the Coast Guard to be organized as a military establishment or to even function as such. Under this bill, the Coast Guard shall consist of the commander, deputy commander, and other commissioned and non-commissioned ranks outlined in the bill further. Funding for the organization will be provided by the Cayman Islands government through the usual appropriations process. The powers, duties, and privileges of the commander are spelled out in Clause 8 of the bill, and the duties of the Coast Guard are outlined in Clause 9. Briefly, Mr. Speaker, some of those duties include the patrol of the territorial sea of the islands and the high seas, providing assistance in the spills of oil or other hazardous chemicals, enforcing local and international laws, conventions, treaties, and instruments, rendering assistance and aid to persons or vessels in distress, organizing, training, and supervising the Coast Guard Reserve, and assisting and cooperating with local law enforcement agencies. The bill gives the Coast Guard power of arrest under Clause 10, outlines the general powers of the Coast Guard in Clause 11, and addresses the seizure, custody, and disposal of a vessel believed to have been used in the commission of an offense in Clause 12. Clause 13 addresses fees in respect of vessels or structures taken into custody or stored by the Coast Guard. The bill also addresses the appointments, enlistments, service, discharge, and termination of Coast Guard members, and outlines the qualifications of becoming a member of the Coast Guard Reserve. Part 6 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, addresses resisting or obstructing arrest by an officer of the Coast Guard and the unauthorized use of the Cayman Islands Coast Guard uniform and decorations. Mr. Speaker, I've only spoken of the highlights of the Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021. I pray that all members of this honorable House have taken the opportunity to read through the bill and fully digest what this bill is proposing to achieve. It is, I think, Mr. Speaker, a very thorough bill, and once enacted, will put us on an excellent footing when it comes to the enhanced security of our waters, our shores, our country, and our people. Mr. Speaker, before I end these remarks, it is important that the Hansards formally record the gratitude of this honorable House to some other key individuals who supported the process of the establishment of the Coast Guard. While we have had help both locally and internationally, the following persons here on the ground in the Cayman Islands have played a very pivotal role in helping bring the vision of a Coast Guard to the reality that we are about to see. These persons, Mr. Speaker, include Chief Officer Wesley Howell and then Deputy Chief Officer Michael Ebanks for being the driving force behind turning concept into reality, and Commander Philip Bostock of Her Majesty's Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, who was seconded to the Cayman Islands in order to help build the case for the establishment of the Coast Guard. He then extended his secondment in order to provide further assistance during the early stages of its formation, and continues to be a source of knowledge on maritime search and rescue matters. I'd also specifically like to mention First Legislative Counsel Mrs. Cheryl Neblett and Senior Legislative Counsel Mrs. Darlene Smith in the Legislative Drafting Department for their tireless efforts in creating the bill we now have before us. People who don't typically get a lot of recognition, Mr. Speaker, although they put in tremendous effort and are absolutely critical to the success of legislation that we bring here. I also want to specifically mention Cabinet Secretary Mr. Samuel Rose, who, as chair of the National Maritime Administration and III Code Compliance 2021 Working Group, provided guidance and support in helping to ensure that the remit of the Coast Guard was clearly defined, especially in relation to its role in helping to ensure maritime safety within our territorial waters. I'd also like to mention, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Joel Walton, CEO of the Maritime Authority, and his team for their support and guidance in helping to ensure that our local and international responsibilities were understood and properly addressed early in the Coast Guard's development phase. Lastly, I'd like to mention the head of the Governor's Office, Ms. Christine Rowlands, who, since her arrival in the Governor's Office, has done everything in her power to support the further development of the Coast Guard by bringing the full support and resources of the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office to bear when necessary. We'd also like to recognize the support provided by the United Kingdom in helping to develop the capabilities of the Cayman Islands Coast Guard through the provision of funding via the Conflict Security and Stabilization Fund. Mr. Speaker, I am deeply encouraged by the potential that the Coast Guard possesses. We have already seen young and aspiring Caymanians indicate their strong interest in joining this new organization, excited by the challenge of serving their country and inspired by the call to the sea previously answered by their forebears. I am sure that all members of this honorable House will join me in wishing the Cayman Islands Coast Guard, under the leadership of Commander Robert Scotland and Lieutenant Commander Leo Anglin, Godspeed, Mr. Speaker. And before I take my seat, I will wish to commend this bill to this honorable Parliament for consideration and trust that it will get full support of colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise this afternoon to express the opposition's support for the Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021. This bill will formally put the Cayman Islands Coast Guard on a firm legislative footing as a uniformed and disciplined department of government. It recognizes the Coast Guard's responsibility for the enforcement of local maritime laws, the coordination and delivery of maritime search and rescue, and ensuring compliance with relevant international law, conventions, and treaties relating to safety of life at sea and pollution prevention. Besides policing our waters, rescuing those in danger at sea is one of the vital roles of the men and women who make up our Coast Guard service. Indeed, the men and women of the service are an integral part of our uniformed services, and their success to date is another proud accomplishment of the Progressives-led administrations of which I was a part. You may recall, Mr. Speaker, that the Cayman Islands Coast Guard, alongside the Customs and Border Control Service, formerly separate Immigration and Customs Services, an upgraded RCIPS Air Operations Unit, and the Cayman Islands Regiment were formed under the previous government. I believe I am correct in saying that the Governor's Office, with the assistance of the UK, were extremely helpful in getting all of these vital projects off the ground. And for that, I again thank the Governor and those in his office who worked diligently to help get us where we are today. The sea borders around our country and our islands has never been more secure than they are presently. But there is much more to be done, but we are well on the way. I commend Commander Robert Scotland, Lieutenant Commander Leo Anglin, and all the officers and men and women of the service for the important work they have been doing since being formed and recruiting and undergoing training. These are genuine professionals who take their important roles seriously, and they serve with pride. I look forward to watching the service grow from strength to strength in the months and years to come. Once again, Mr. Speaker, I reiterate that we in the opposition give our full support to the Coast Guard, and we support this bill. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Last call. Does any other member wish to speak? The member from East End.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to add my support and short contribution to the government's bill shortly entitled Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021. The bill is a testament to the determination of the people of the Cayman Islands to gain more responsibility and control over their local affairs. However, one must give credit where credit is due, and I wish to thank the previous administration who made contributions to help bring this Cayman Islands Coast Guard bill to where it is today. Today is truly historic in many sense. As a small nation, we should be proud of what the addition of a Coast Guard unit does. is not only charged with the protection of our territorial waters, saving lives, but also how it connects with the history of Caymanian seamen who made a living on the seas. Prior to today's moving of the bill, I had the opportunity to speak with the current Coast Guard Commander, Commander Robert Scotland. Our conversation was quite important to me for many reasons, but two in particular. The first being that currently the two highest ranking officers within the current makeup of the Coast Guard are Caymanian, sir. This is not only commendable, but it's also encouraging to the Caymanians already enlisted to know that they can strive and grow and create a fulfilling career within the Cayman Islands Coast Guard unit. On that note, I wish to encourage all Caymanians, in particular, young Caymanians looking for a meaningful career, to consider the noble role of being a Cayman Islands Coast Guard. The second reason is that it was reassuring to know the commitment of the commander and his lieutenant commander. He himself also shared with me his view of the Coast Guard, as he noted, the Cayman Islands is surrounded by water, and prior to 2020 had a rapidly growing boating community. With that growth came the potential increase of boating incidents. This will be the case again as our borders reopen. As we look around at the number of private and commercial vessels, we see the need for a dedicated maritime organization, not one like the RCIPS Marine Unit that was constantly being depleted of persons and fundings to meet serious crime occurring on land. We also needed an entity that has the sole responsibility of dealing with maritime, whether that was saving lives, enforcing safety regulations, or keeping drugs and firearms from reaching our shores. A Coast Guard will do this while offering new and rewarding jobs to our young people and afford them a chance to follow in the steps of their grand and great-grandparents as proud seafarers. Mr. Speaker, I know that all members of this Honorable House understands that the seafaring heritage plays an integral role in our self-identity. It was what made our forefathers revered. It was what made the Cayman Islands by taking us from the islands that time forgot to a leading financial center and a robust tourism industry pre-COVID. The bill which the Honorable Premier has already spoken on and moved, and he has already explained the benefits of the addition of the Cayman Islands Coast Guard. However, I wish to emphasize another point made by Commander Scotland during our discussion, in that we will now be able to respond to incidents on our waters that can save lives with the addition of the Cayman Islands Coast Guard. Mr. Speaker, in addition to speaking with Commander Scotland, I had the opportunity to speak with some of the seamen from my constituency. Those that I spoke to were in full support of this bill, as they had experience with the services of the Coast Guard unit at some point in their travels during their seaman days. As a nation, we are very proud of our growth, and I hope that the Coast Guard will continue to grow from strength to strength. Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank each member who has joined the service so far and remain confident that our shores are safer with the job that the Coast Guard unit currently does. I stand in support of the bill, and I commend it to all honorable members. Thank you, sir.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Red Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition has said of the government, habits are strong things. The Opposition's position with respect to our support for this important bill, and I really don't wish to add much in that regard. I endorse entirely what he has said. But, Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't let the opportunity pass for me to make a few observations. Mr. Speaker, the member from East End is absolutely right. What perhaps, Mr. Speaker, he may not be aware of is how long the challenges that he mentioned about personnel and assets, equipment, how long those things have been an issue under the old regime where there was a joint marine unit. Decades. And that, Mr. Speaker, together with that most tragic incident where a number of Caymanians went missing at sea and no trace of them has ever been found. Those things combine to galvanize the government which I led from 2013 to earlier this year to push and shove, quite frankly, to establish a Coast Guard. This polished document which is here today is the product of much sweat, I wouldn't say blood, but certainly sweat, tears, and frustration, and battling with the establishment to create a separate unit with its own legislation and its own structure. Do not believe that this was an easily won achievement, because there were those who believed firmly that this ought to stay under the Commissioner of Police. It is one of my few regrets, Mr. Speaker, of my term as Premier, that given the events which occurred and led up, unfortunate events, led up to the early elections, I was not able to bring and present this bill myself. But nevertheless, I'm very familiar with the text of it and understand very well the reason for the various provisions which are contained in it. I also want, Mr. Speaker, to say how proud but also relieved I was when the Commandant, Robert Scotland, and the Deputy Commandant, Leo Anglin, as those titles that they now have, agreed to head up this new establishment. Well, you can believe, were there not a strong push on our end, the nationality of the people leading this Coast Guard would not be the one that it is today. Mr. Speaker, those are two very able young men, perhaps not so young anymore. But they had to be persuaded, Mr. Speaker, that this was really going to happen and that they would wind up with responsibility for a unit over which they did have control with respect to recruitment, with respect to its assets, with respect to its capital. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am delighted, and I wish to thank the Premier and his government for bringing this bill, even though the Coast Guard as a unit has been going for more than a year. I also wish to thank the Commandant and the Deputy Commandant for inviting me to address the very first class of recruits, and they were very, very impressive. I don't know what the results are and if all of them actually completed the course successfully. But I hope that the Premier in his winding up could be able to give us a report in that regard. But they did seem an incredibly able bunch, and something that made me very, very proud. They were all, Mr. Speaker, without exception, all Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, this is an entity I know we will all come to be very proud of. And I am glad now that with the passage, the safe passage of this bill today, it will become an entity onto its own, a statutory entity onto its own self. I think, Mr. Speaker, this is an incredible achievement for a country as small as we are. And again, Mr. Speaker, in many respects, we remain leaders in the region, certainly among small or countries with small populations. And so, Mr. Speaker, I join with the Premier and my leader in asking, or in commending this bill to the House and asking for unanimous support of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable the Minister of Sports and Home Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I had no intention of re-speaking because when it was presented, it was what everyone was happy to see. But listening to what the Premier, the former Premier, the member from Red Bay, gave us a history on the fight, I'm pleased to say that part of the discussion on bringing this bill here was also a clause in this that says the governor shall appoint A commandant, a deputy commandant, and B, a Coast Guard medical officer. I and other members have asked that it should say the governor shall appoint A commandant and a deputy commandant, and B, a Coast Guard medical officer, each of whom shall or should, this would be a discussion we'll have, be a Caymanian. And seeing that I'm in charge, I'm the minister responsible for the regiment, this is something that we will also be bringing to continue our policies of Caymanizing and making sure that Caymanians hold the post in these various things that we are entitled to, that we are able to, and we want to hit. So thank you very much for the history from the former from the member from Red Bay, and for our Premier for bringing it and making sure that it's here. Thank you very much.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't intend to be long, but I certainly want to lend my voice in support of the bill before the House, the Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021. And to say, Mr. Speaker, that like previous speakers, I too wish to highlight the significance of this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and indeed what it embodies. Mr. Speaker, I am particularly pleased to see the duties set out in Clause 9, Mr. Speaker, of the bill. Speaks that the duties of the Coast Guard are to patrol the territorial sea of the islands and the high seas. And Mr. Speaker, you would fully appreciate the significance of this given the open nature of our borders in the Cayman Islands. and the need for a dedicated agency to be tasked with the responsibility, Mr. Speaker, of policing the borders. It goes on to speak, Mr. Speaker, in 9(1)(f), grant within its legal and operational capabilities requests for assistance from local and international government agencies in the performance of their functions and which are consistent with the duties and functions of the Coast Guard. And, Mr. Speaker, 9(1)(j), cooperate with local and international law enforcement agencies or the armed forces of another country by taking the necessary measures to ensure the suppression of illicit activities occurring in the territorial sea of the islands or on the high seas, provided the measures do not extend into the maritime jurisdiction of another state or territory without that state's or territory's express permission. Mr. Speaker, it is no secret that we have a problem in these islands with the illicit trafficking of drugs and other contrabands. And, Mr. Speaker, the advent of a Coast Guard with the able expertise of the current commandant and the deputy commandant, Mr. Speaker, will certainly enhance the ability of the jurisdiction to interdict, Mr. Speaker, the flow of such matters. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to lend my voice also in saying that the two gentlemen referenced here, Mr. Scotland and Anglin, Mr. Speaker, are persons who are known to me from way back, and I can speak of their passion and their professionalism, Mr. Speaker, in whatever they do. They have carried that professionalism and passion across into the Coast Guard. And if you watch and listen to them, Mr. Speaker, you can't help but agree that this entity is in very, very capable hands, Mr. Speaker. And I certainly wish them well. I wish them all the best and hope that they will be able from time to time be assisted by able men and women of these islands who can assist in furthering the objectives of the Coast Guard, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to also commend this legislation to members of this Parliament. I thank you, sir.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable, the Deputy Governor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I shall be brief. Mr. Speaker, as head of the Civil Service, this is I think, a very, very happy day for us to see our Coast Guard being formed and given legislative support. Mr. Speaker, the member for Red Bay set out the background as to, or the driving force behind the creation of a Coast Guard. I won't go there. But I can say that for many years we had a joint marine unit, which on many occasions were not joint. It was made up mainly of the police. It was envisaged that immigration and customs would be part of it. But for various reasons, from time to time, that never happened. Staff shortages, police had rising crime, so persons were moved from the Marine unit to deal with crime. And that was one of the issues that we wanted to resolve in the creation of the Coast Guard, is that we would have a separate ring-fence unit that would be focused on border security. Mr. Speaker, we're a small island. There's no guns made here. There's not a lot of drugs that actually is made here. The majority of it is imported. So we have that overriding responsibility to keep our borders policed, keep them safe, and to do everything we can to stop illegal contraband coming into our islands. But in addition, Mr. Speaker, we have refugees, we have asylum seekers coming in that needs to be properly dealt with, and of course, the security of our people in terms of when they're out boating and their safety. So it is so, just to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm really happy today that we have reached this momentous occasion. Mr. Speaker, like the member from Red Bay, I had the great pleasure, and it really was a great pleasure to speak to the new recruits of the Coast Guard. And I want to commend the commander and the deputy commander for putting together a vigorous recruitment exercise that really allowed them to choose the best of the best. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to various graduation classes and numerous recruits, but I've never seen any group of young Caymanians being more attentive, displaying that high degree of professionalism at day one, not at the end of their graduation, but very early on. They showed that maturity, they showed that dedication, they showed that commitment to the cause. And I've been watching them ever since, and they have always answered the call of duty. And they are making us proud, Mr. Speaker. They are making us proud every day, and they are keeping us safe. Mr. Speaker, we are a seafaring nation, and as the members have said here, I think it's so important for our young people to want to be part of this organization, to follow in the footsteps of our grandfathers and our fathers, to be seamen. And you don't have now to go overseas. You can do it right here as part of our Coast Guard. Mr. Speaker, we had a vision, and I know the Minister of Youth Sports and also Home Affairs has the same vision, where the member of our cadets will graduate up from leaving the cadets to go into our law enforcement agents. And I was so pleased to see that a number of cadets have also joined the Coast Guard. So it's our systems are working, Mr. Speaker. It's giving our people opportunities at a very young age to learn the discipline of our uniformed services and to graduate up into the other uniformed services, the police, CBC, and now the Coast Guard. So this is a great day for us, Mr. Speaker. I commend the bill to everyone, and I do hope that everyone will support the bill. And again, kudos to the commander and the deputy commander for the excellent work that they're doing. They're making us very proud. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the Honorable the Premier to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all members who have contributed, in particular the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, in his clear support of the member from Red Bay and his clear support and his historical background in respect of the challenges of getting the Coast Guard set up initially and being a part of the instructions and drafting on the Coast Guard bill. And I want to thank all the other members who have not spoken, Mr. Speaker, for their tacit support. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the first class I understand there were about 150 applicants, and there was 16 members, 16 persons selected, put through the training course. All 16 of those applicants selected graduated, made it through, and Mr. Speaker, every one of them was a Caymanian.
Yay!
So that's a particularly proud point for all this Parliament, but all of Cayman, really, and those graduates in particular, and those two fine gentlemen, Commander Scotland and Lieutenant Commander Anglin, who command the Coast Guard. They have obviously done an absolutely stellar job in the training. And to be honest, Mr. Speaker, one only has to speak to both of those gentlemen to see the way in which they reflect the kind of discipline, the kind of commitment, all of which will make all of Cayman proud. And I believe the services they will provide will be all excellent and make us all safer and continue to make us proud. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that, you know, there are individuals who have been involved in a similar manner in the past, much less structure, the Joint Marine Task Force, that did what they had to do and did what they could as well. And in my younger days, I had some sort of informal involvement with some of them, and I think they are to be congratulated as well for the work that they did over the years in helping to try to make sure that our borders were as secure as possible. There was certainly a lot going on then as it is now. The challenges have become greater, and I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that we will have a Coast Guard that will deliver what we expect it to deliver. And with these two fine gentlemen and this current cohort of Caymanian members of the Coast Guard, I think we can all be justly proud. With that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you all again, and I'll take my seat.
Thank you, Premier. The question is that a bill shortly entitled the Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021 be given a second reading. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Those against? The ayes have it. The Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021 has been given a second reading.
Immigration Transition Amendment Bill 2021.
The Immigration Transition Bill Amendment Bill 2021. The Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of the Immigration Transition Amendment Bill 2021.
The bill has been duly moved. The Honorable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the ongoing human costs of the global COVID-19 pandemic is staggering. The disease has now infected over 225 million people and caused more than 4.8 million deaths around the world. However, Mr. Speaker, here in the Cayman Islands, we have been very fortunate compared to many other countries. Since the 13th of March 2020, when the first case of COVID-19 was detected, there have been more than 850 confirmed cases and more than 780 recoveries, and sadly, Mr. Speaker, only 2 unfortunate deaths. Our successes, Mr. Speaker, can be attributed to the early closure of our borders and swift implementation of movement restrictions, border controls, community monitoring, and public health prevention measures to stop the spread of the virus. Mr. Speaker, as a country, we have done well to limit the impact of the pandemic in human life terms. However, the economic impact has been serious. Mr. Speaker, we all know too well that the tourism sector and tourist-reliant industries were hit hard, and thousands of workers became unemployed virtually overnight. Support to displaced tourism workers, Mr. Speaker, by way of stipend payments is costing the public purse more than $5 million every month. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, through a public-private partnership effort, small businesses affected by the pandemic are also being assisted by way of guaranteed low-interest bank loans with deferred payments, payments of health insurance premiums, and a freeze on pension payments. Workers were able to withdraw a portion of their pension, Mr. Speaker, to help them meet the necessary expenses during these uncertain times. Mr. Speaker, the government is doing its utmost to support those Caymanian families that have been negatively impacted as a result of the border closures. However, as we look across the world, a fact that has to be accepted is that we have to learn to safely coexist with COVID-19 for years to come. Mr. Speaker, the detection of a number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 involving local transmission in the past weeks, even affecting our children, as well as increases in the number of persons testing positive during post-travel quarantine and multiple breaches of home isolation requirements are very concerning developments and a stark reminder that we remain very much at risk. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, the first thing and very challenging step toward economic recovery is through the safe reopening of our borders. A critical aspect of this is ensuring that as high a percentage of our population as possible is vaccinated. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the vaccination target set by the government based on public health advice is that 80% of the resident population, regardless of where persons were vaccinated. The current vaccination rate of 78% first dose and 73% second dose only takes into account vaccination administered in the islands. So it could be expected that the arrival of new workers from overseas will cause that figure to increase. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, this government will continue to push for higher vaccination numbers, especially when the potentially serious impact of the highly contagious Delta variant. Although the mandatory vaccination requirement is likely to be controversial, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that as many eligible persons as possible get vaccinated with an approved vaccine will only further aid in the government's effort to protect our residents while exploring avenues to safely reopen our borders as part of our economic recovery plan. To this end, Mr. Speaker, the government has previously made public its intention to introduce mandatory vaccination requirements for new workers and those seeking renewal of their work permits. As such, the bill before this Honorable House today seeks to introduce mandatory vaccination requirements to all eligible persons and their eligible dependents who are subject to immigration control with respect to their residence or employment in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, I would like to use this opportunity to also announce that there will be a committee stage amendment that will exempt holders of Residency and Employment Rights Certificate, otherwise known as RERC. This decision was made after consultation with members of the public, and I will expand on that issue more during the committee stages. Mr. Speaker, I'll now turn to the matters referred to in the Immigration Transition Amendment Bill 2021 that will require all persons who are applying for the grant or renewal of a residence or facility under Part 6 and 7 of the Immigration Transition Act 2021 to provide proof that they have completed an approved vaccine course or agree that they will undertake to complete an approved vaccination course or comply with other instructions given by the medical officer of health within a specific period of time. For the avoidance of doubt, Mr. Speaker, the residence employment facilities which would be subject to the mandatory vaccination requirement under the primary legislation, that is Immigration Transition Act 2021, are as follows. And Mr. Speaker, this will be the final list that will be subject to what it is that we're speaking about. 1, permanent residents, that is persons legally and ordinary resident to the islands for at least 8 years when applying to vary permanent residents or to add dependents. 2, permanent resident, dependent children of permanent residents who have reached 18. 3, residency certificate for persons of independent means, and when applying to vary a certificate to add dependents. 4, certificate of permanent residence for persons of independent means. 5, applications to vary a certificate for persons of independent means or a certificate of permanent residence for persons of independent means to add a dependent. 6, certificate of direct investment. 7, certificate for specialist caregivers. 8, residency certificate, referring to those with substantial business presence. 9, work permit, including a temporary work permit. 10, persons who are employed through a cabinet-granted exemption from work permit requirements. 11, amendments of a work permit to add dependents. And 12, amendment to a permanent residence application, applicant's permission to continue working to add dependents. Mr. Speaker, for persons already in the islands, the prospective employee or their employer will be required to provide the board or director of workforce opportunities and residency Cayman, otherwise known as WORK, with a vaccination certificate relating to that person and any eligible dependents when an application to grant the right to be employed or to reside in the Cayman Islands or for the renewal of such right. Persons entering the Cayman Islands from other countries that do not have an approved vaccination program or who are unvaccinated and any eligible dependents who have been vaccinated with a vaccine course which is not approved vaccine course will need to sign a declaration of their willingness to comply with any directions of the medical officer of health. Mr. Speaker, in the case of an unvaccinated person or dependents of the persons, they too must sign a declaration to complete an approved vaccine course and provide a vaccination certificate to work within one of the following time frames. A, within 40 days after the application has been granted or renewed. B, within 40 days after arrival in the Cayman Islands if the person does not reside in the Cayman Islands. Or C, within such other period of time as directed by the medical officer of health. Mr. Speaker, this government is acutely aware that there are persons who, for medical reasons, will not be able to take a vaccine course. Therefore, powers are provided for in the bills for the medical officer of health to grant an exemption in exceptional circumstances. Details of those exemptions, Mr. Speaker, must be reported to Cabinet periodically to help inform Cabinet's future policy decisions. Mr. Speaker, this government is mindful that the Cayman Islands, having access to an approved vaccination program, places these islands in an excellent position to protect our residents, and there are many countries who are not in as fortunate a state as we currently enjoy. Hence the provision for all applicants to undertake an approved vaccine course within a 40-day period after an application has been granted or renewed. However, Mr. Speaker, to ensure compliance with vaccination requirements, there are provisions in the bill which indicate that the board or director of work shall have no power to decide on an application unless or until the prescribed requirements have been met. Putting it simply, Mr. Speaker, no decision can be taken on an application until the applicant has either submitted proof of a vaccination certificate confirming that an approved vaccination course has been taken or a certified exemption. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, the bills empower the board or director of work to revoke an approved facility where the holder fails to comply their declaration of any instruction given by the medical officer of health. In this instance, Mr. Speaker, the applicant would be required to leave the Cayman Islands. As stated previously, Mr. Speaker, the introduction of a mandatory vaccination program for persons who are subject to immigration control is a very emotive subject. There will be people who support the government in this policy direction, and on the flip side, there will be people who oppose the government's decision. No legislation will be introduced without some level of pushback. And regarding the ideals of freedom of choice and the right to choose, we understand that this is an important issue. However, Mr. Speaker, what cannot be ignored is the deadly impact COVID-19 has had on many countries, citizens, and public health systems. And as I've said before, we are here in these seats of responsibility to make the hard decisions, but more importantly, the right decisions. Mr. Speaker, this is the right decision. The preservation of life is the most important tenet of our Constitution. And we are giving people a choice. They can choose to come here or they can choose to come here or to remain here and comply with our laws. As a government, Mr. Speaker, our most fundamental and important job is to keep our community, our kids, our elderly, our vulnerable, safe. There are Caymanians and residents that are unable to get vaccinated, and it is our responsibility to ensure that those who can get vaccinated do so to protect the vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, my government colleagues and I are confident that we have taken a balanced approach to these bills and have adequately considered the rights of individuals in proportion to public safety and public health. We stand firmly in belief that these requirements are in the overall best interest of these beloved Cayman Islands and all those who live here. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would just like to read a letter that was, public release by the Human Rights Commission on proposed COVID-19 vaccination policy for work permit holders. And I just ask, this is already in the public domain, and I think you guys have copies of this. Do you guys need copies in the opposition? For immediate release, date June 3rd, 2021, issued by Human Rights Commission. And the headline reads, Mr. Speaker, HR statement on proposed COVID-19 vaccination policy for work permit holders. The Human Rights Commission continues to follow the ongoing COVID-19 global pandemic and its implication for Cayman Islands residents. Most recently, the Commission noted that the Cayman Islands government newly proposed regulations requiring COVID-19 vaccination in specified groups. For persons currently on a work permit or applying for a work permit, the grant or renewal of a work permit can be provided with conditions such as the requirements to be vaccinated, in this case against COVID-19. A more extensive legal commentary of this was presented in the Cayman Compass article titled, "Can Employers Insist Staff Get the COVID-19 Vaccination?" which was done on 30th of April 2021. Goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, government has a duty to protect the lives of all the individuals in the Cayman Islands as outlined in Section 2 of the Bill of Rights, right to life. A duty it has already exercised throughout the COVID-19 global pandemic, such as with the implementation of border closures and shopping days by last name, curfews, limitations on gatherings over certain numbers, requirements for wearing face masks, etc. The mandating of vaccination against COVID-19 for grants or renewals of work permits is another condition which government can put in place once assessed that it is lawful, rational, proportionate, and procedurally fair, i.e., in line with Section 19 of the Bill of Rights on Lawful Administrative Action. However, the government policy would have to allow for exceptional circumstances in which exemptions could be granted, such as cases where medical contraindications exist. Thank you, Premier. That one is, yeah. The Commission has also noted discussion of potential restriction employers can put on employees regarding vaccination against COVID-19. The matter was examined in detail in a public statement released by local law firm HSM in April of this year. And whilst the Commission can provide legal advice or endorse one particular perspective, employers may find its analysis useful. Human rights is a balancing act, and in balancing the rights of individuals, government has a responsibility to balance all rights. Section 16 of the Bill of Rights, Non-Discrimination, allows for discrimination in limited circumstances where the discrimination has an objective and reasonable justification and is reasonably proportionate to its aim in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health. The Human Rights Commission joins the Cayman Islands government in encouraging persons to be vaccinated. Individuals can find the latest vaccination schedule and other information about COVID-19 vaccination program here. And it ends. Mr. Speaker, in concluding my introduction of this bill, I wish to thank all those who have worked quickly to develop and modify processes, identify solutions, and make it possible for essential services to continue during these challenging times. On a more personal note, Mr. Speaker, I want to say, and I think I can safely say this on behalf of everyone on the government side, as I said before, this was not a decision that we took lightly. We and many people in the Cayman Islands, including the opposition and members of this parliament, worked very hard to get to the 80% target to ensure that we have the best protection available for everyone that calls the Cayman Islands home. And Mr. Speaker, the math is simple. When we do it the 80%, if we allow everyone to come into this country, or other people to come into this country and they're unvaccinated, the truth is, Mr. Speaker, the 80% number is going to be diluted. We're going to be falling more and more and more as the economy picks up, which is what everyone wants, is for the economy to pick up. We cannot afford, Mr. Speaker, after 18 months of sacrifices by the Caymanian people and all those who call the Cayman Islands home, to turn back now. We are going to embark on a journey where we're going to try to do what no country has successfully done when they went to reopen. And as such, Mr. Speaker, despite the challenges we have, and yes, we do question some things from the program board, we do question things that are presented to us, because again, as I said before, our system of democracy, while it requires some level of trust, it also requires some level of verification. And in this instance, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about our children. We're talking about people for medical reasons that cannot be vaccinated. And it is our right and duty, not just for members of parliament, for every person in this community, to rise up and play their part. I want to thank the 78% thus far that have gone out and have taken at least the first dose. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that there are some people out there who had own medical challenges, and they still tried to take the vaccine. And I want to say to those people a special thank you, because they were at risk, but they still tried to do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, I have received calls from people within the civil service that have said point blank they don't even want to work with people who are unvaccinated. People are aware of this issue. More than 4.8 million people is dead within less than 2 years. This has been one of the worst global pandemics in 100 years. And because, and I am very grateful, Mr. Speaker, to the efforts of the previous government and under the leadership of the member for Red Bay for the steps that they took in terms of locking down the place to reduce the community spread. But, Mr. Speaker, it's time for us now to start looking to rejoin the global community and start reuniting Caymanian families, and also for those who love to visit the Cayman Islands, give them an opportunity to come back here. I know this is not easy. And yes, we've already been threatened with legal lawsuits and everything else. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? The story of the Cayman Islands has always been one that we have always prevailed. And I will say to the Caymanian people that are listening, this too shall pass away, and the Cayman Islands will be here. With that said, Mr. Speaker, I'm asking all members of this Parliament to support this amendment to the Immigration Transition Act 2021 to ensure that we protect all Caymanians and all those who call the Cayman Islands home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We will suspend proceedings until 7:15.